I've included this little time-lapse video to show how your starter will grow and expand overnight. We really can't emphasize the importance of keeping a good healthy starter. So what I do is normally take 100 grams from my mother starter and mix it with 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water and put it in a separate jar, and then you can keep an eye on it overnight and watch it grow. Over time you'll start to see how temperature affects the growth of the starter and when it's going to reach its peak. Ideally you need to use your starter when it's reached its peak condition. Now if you watch this video you'll see it takes absolutely ages to start going, and then once it starts to grow you can see the healthy bubbles start to form, and it's virtually doubling and trebling in size. So you need to get a handle on when it's reached its peak, because that's when you need to bake your bread. And also, once you know when it's going to reach its peak, you can start doing your time for when you got to start baking. As can be seen from this clip, it took a total of about 20 hours for it to reach its peak. So that's quite a long time. And, you need to be able to manage that time, so setting it off at the correct time will roughly give you an indication of when it's going to be ready to do your mixture to bake your bread. Now, as can be seen as well, the room temperature is about 15 degrees, which is average room temperature. So be prepared to wait and don't try and start baking too early, because you'll notice the difference in your finished bread. Don't be tempted to use your starter too early or to leave it too late. Once it's reached its peak, it will then start deflating and going down, and that means that it's used all of its protein up in the starter and there is no more. So it won't be its peak, you won't get your perfect loaf. Next I'm going to weigh off 650 grams of water. Weighing it is far more accurate than using a measuring jug. Also going to add in here a couple of teaspoons of sugar. This helps with the fermentation of the bread and also adds a bit of nice sweetness. Another optional extra here is to roast off some mixed seeds. I use pumpkin, sunflower, pine nuts, sesame, nigella seeds, but you can use anything you like. Just adds that nice nutty flavour to the bread. Stick them in a little cast pan and put them in an air fryer or something. Here I'm doing 170 degrees for about 20 minutes. Measure out your flour. I use a mixture of 750 grams of very strong white flour and 250 of wholemeal flour, and this gives you 1,000 grams of flour in total. When mixing the rest of the ingredients, I find it much easier to add in your water first and then mix in your starter to that. Then you can add the rest of your ingredients and give them a good mix. The water here is still at room temperature. Not using a warm water makes the fermentation process much longer and gives you a nice fuller flavour. Give the starter and the water a thoroughly good mix, and then add in 2 tablespoons of salt into the flour. Some put the salt in later to help kickstart the fermentation process, but I've never found it makes any difference. I'm using Allinson's flour here. As long as it's a strong wholemeal, it doesn't make any difference. Just keep an eye on the protein content on the side of the packet. Anything around 14 grams is good for sourdough. So I've got my total of flour mixed now to 1,000 grams, which with my 650 grams of water, in theory, makes a 65% hydration. However, with the starter, I've roughly worked out that this mix is probably somewhere between 65 and 70% hydration, which is good for sourdough and makes it easy to handle the dough. I do my mixing by hand using a half round silicone scraper. Can be hard work to start with as the dough's a bit sticky at this stage, but keep going and boss the dough. As a great Richard Burton says, don't let the dough get in charge of you, get in charge of the dough. So keep going with it and it will come together and get much easier. As you can see, it starts to stick to itself rather than anything else. Persevere with the mixing and keep scraping down the sides of the bowl so it keeps everything nice and clear and tidy. Persevere with your mixing and you should end up with something like this, a nice gooey mess. Keep scraping down the sides of the bowl to keep it tidy. I'll keep a jug of water by the side, and when I've finished bringing it together, I'll wet my hands and cut round the dough, easing it away from the bowl. This moistens the surface area of the dough and prevents it from drying out too much during the resting stage. Once you've done this and it's roughly shaped, get a nice clean tea towel and cover it. Go and get yourself a timer and set it for 1 hour. During this first hour, the starter, flour and water mix will start to produce gluten strains. These strains give the dough mix extra strength, which means we'll be able to stretch the dough and turn it, allowing some air to get in and build up even more strength for the dough. The timer is ticking away and the room temperature is showing around 22 degrees. After an hour, I'll wet my hands and turn the mixture over. I think this is an optional extra that I read somewhere that someone did, and I've always done it. I'm not sure if it makes any difference at all. It's just one of those things that I do. It can't be a bad thing to put more air into the dough mix. Some people do this 2 or 3 times. I do it the once and then just leave it. Once the dough's been turned, it can then be covered and left to bulk proof. This bulk proof could take anything from 8 hours plus. Really depends on the room temperature and the flour that you've used. Try not to get too hung up on timescales, rather than using your eyes to just check every now and again and see how the dough is rising. I like to see that the dough's at least doubled in size, and in my case about 1 inch from the top of this white bowl. Once happy that the dough's risen sufficiently, it can then be considered ready for turning out onto your floured work surface. The Banneton baskets will need to be given a good dusting with the flour mix. Don't be concerned about using too much flour. You don't want your dough sticking into the baskets, and the flour can be brushed off very easily at the end. It can also be collected up and put back in a tin and used again for the next time. For this I use rice flour, semolina and a corn malt. I use rice flour instead of any other flour because it doesn't contain any glutens and won't affect the recipe. It also has excellent anti-adhesion qualities. The flour just doesn't stick to the work surface. I use the semolina and the golden corn malt because it gives a lovely rustic finish to the bread. Now the dough can be divided into 2. I just use a dough scraper for this. Once divided, the dough then needs to be folded and shaped, ready to be put into the Banneton baskets. While shaping, be careful with the dough. You don't want to lose any of that lovely air that's been building up inside. Drop the dough into the pre-floured Banneton baskets. Cover and set aside for the final proof. Once again, don't get too hung up on the time. I mean, it's going to be roughly about 1.5 hours, but it's better off visually looking at the bread. The dough needs to have risen and started to push into the side of the Banneton, taking on its shape. From my experience, the dough would have risen to within about 1/2 inch, about 1 centimetre of the top of the basket. It would be a mistake to leave the dough too long at this stage. This would cause the bread to over-prove, and then when it comes to scoring the bread before putting in the oven, it will deflate, leaving it flat. Once the basket proof is complete, the dough then needs to be put into the fridge. Putting it into the fridge will eventually stop the proving process, but just remember the dough will take at least 1/2 hour to reach fridge temperature, so for those clock watchers you can probably say that they'd be still proving for at least another 1/2 hour within the fridge. Chilling the bread down to fridge temperature will also make the bread much easier to handle when you try to release it from the baskets. A chilled dough is also much firmer, and this makes it much easier to score with the razor blade. I'm not making a party hat here or a paper plane. I'm cutting out a circle in a bit of parchment paper. This I'm going to lay in the bottom of my cast pan and stop the dough from sticking to the hot metal. The cast iron pan I use actually has two parts. It has a deep side and a shallow side, and also comes with a handle that makes it really easy to get in and out of the oven. So I use it as a Dutch oven, which is ideal for my round sourdough. The oven I use for baking in my kitchen is actually a commercial one, and I use this because it reaches temperatures higher than a domestic one. The one I'm using here goes up to 300 degrees Celsius, so I heat my pan for an hour before, and it's extremely hot. Turning the cold dough out onto my preheated cast pan means it almost immediately starts to cook. It tends to hold its shape better when I'm scoring it. The other half of my pan is still in the oven at temperature, which means that when I put the two together, the dough is encased in its own little Dutch oven and cooking almost straight away. And into the hot oven it goes for about 25 minutes. After 25 minutes, I'll take the lid off the cast pan and cook for another 5 minutes at full temperature. And here we have it, 3.5 days later, my freshly baked sourdough loaf. Was it worth it? You bet it was. Carefully remove from the fiercely hot pan and let cool on a wire rack. Dust off the excess flour and it's good to eat.